Hi everybody, and welcome to the meeting of the Amherst Planning Board. This is our community forum on inclusionary zoning, next steps. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to Amherst Media for agreeing to tape this so that people who can't make it tonight can also participate. The Planning Board, as you may know, brought an inclusionary zoning article to spring town meeting, special town meeting, which we subsequently asked be referred back due to a lot of issues that arose after we had asked town meeting to approve it. And so as part of it being referred back to us, we wanted to solicit additional public input at a public forum and allow for people to give their input on inclusionary zoning. The purpose is to just identify everybody who has a stake in this issue and facilitate dialogue to create, hopefully, a new and improved inclusionary zoning article for fall special town meeting. We, at the board, at our June 18th meeting, identified the following list of issues that we were going to try to address tonight. In other words, questions and open issues with respect to inclusionary zoning that we're soliciting comment on. Achieving a proper balance between carrots and sticks, that is to say incentives and requirements for percentage of inclusionary zoning. Also questions about whether to allow dimensional incentives like extra height, lot coverage, and also whether to allow fees and how much fees in lieu of actual units to allow. And I'll give a little intro in a moment about inclusionary zoning. Some of this stuff is a little technical. Financial feasibility of projects, possible tax breaks, which is a non-zoning bylaw issue, the so-called nexus requirement with public purpose, and to identify any issues about upcoming public works projects. So, for those of you who may just be new to inclusionary zoning, or you're watching this on television and wondering what we're doing here, inclusionary zoning is a relatively new concept that requires developers of a given number of units of housing, in our case currently 10 or more in Amherst, to include a percentage of affordable units as a portion of that development. We currently, in our zoning bylaw, under Article 15, have some inclusionary zoning requirements. However, as currently in place, they only are applied to developments that require a special permit for the use. So what that's meant is that we've had some developments over the last couple of years that have come in that have had multiple units of housing and yet have not been required under this zoning bylaw to provide affordable units. Our goal is going forward to try to capture more of the residential development and increase the stock of affordable housing in town. One way of doing that is to amend our zoning bylaw with respect to inclusionary zoning. So, thanks everybody for coming tonight. We appreciate you being here, and I think I'm going to ask just for comments from the board if anybody had any prepared remarks or anything you wanted to say. And then I propose to devote the bulk of this meeting to hearing public comment. We're going to wrap up at 9 o'clock tonight, and we do have a number of people here, so if you can keep your comments short and to the point, and please try not to repeat anybody who's said something before you. All right, any comments from the board? Mr. Crowner.
We have an interest, the town has an interest in trying to diversify the housing stock, allowing a wide range of people to live here. We also have an interest in, or the planning board has expressed an interest, the master plan expresses an interest in directing our predominance of our new residential development to mixed-use centers. And the problem is that in those centers, most or all of the uses are allowed by right, so they don't require special permit, so we need to, what we're proposing to do with inclusionary zoning is to extend the mandate for affordable housing to all residential uses and development methods. The problem that follows from that is that the cost of providing that housing is trickier, it's harder, it's more expensive in centers. And so what we don't want to do is impose a mandate that depresses development where we actually want it. And so the trick here, the problem is to find the right balance. And so that's what we're trying to do. We haven't found the right balance yet.
Thank you, Mr. Crowder. All right, if no one else on the board or staff has opening remarks, we'll go directly to public comment. If you'd like to speak, just please raise your hand. Tell them you can stand or sit as you like. Tell us who you are and if you represent any particular group, and then let us know what you think. In the front row.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. I'm Aaron Hayden. I'm the chair of the Select Board. This is an incredibly important piece of work that you're doing, and we want to honor that importance by having this is an announced meeting for us, and I see we're a quorum here, so we are actually having a parallel Select Board meeting of sorts. There are a couple of things, we talked about this on Monday night, this event, and also the issue going forward. There's a couple of things that we wanted you to know from us. First of all, you mentioned that there might be non-planning aspects to getting this done, to getting inclusionary, to encouraging inclusionary construction. We're all ears. We're kind of interested in exploring that. Probably not tonight because this is a planning meeting, but we will be looking into that as we can going down in the future. Low-income housing is the focus of tonight's meeting. And as I mentioned, it's very, very important. I want to remind everybody that there are other types of housing that are going wanting in town as well. We learned this from the housing production study. And while it's not focused for tonight's meeting, something that I hope we keep in the back of our mind as we move forward with planning articles, planning amendments, so that we might figure out how to increase housing and make Amherst an attractive place for people with young families to live, a demographic that we all now know are leaving us by the droves, it seems. Lastly, we're incredibly hopeful that given your amazing schedule for this summer, you're going to be meeting every week to try to beat this down and figure it out. We're very hopeful that there'll be something that we can all react to in a positive way at town meeting this fall. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hayden. Also, thank you for agreeing to take a look at the non-planning aspects of things such as tax incentives and things along those lines, because those are beyond our purview.
Yes.
And may play an important part in trying to increase the affordable housing stock. Thank you for your comments. Yes, in the back.
Yes, Helen Berg. I understand that this only obligates the property owner to maintain those units for the life of whatever mortgage that person has. Is that true?
Mr. Crown.
The way we have written, at least the way we wrote Article 24, was that we wanted affordability to be held in perpetuity, except where otherwise the law doesn't allow it. So, I mean, there might be some instance where a mortgage requires the affordability to be released after 30 or 40 years or something. We're not going to override the state law or anything, but the intention is to make it permanent.
Thank you, Mr. Cronin. Next. Yes, Ms. Rubenstein.
Elisa Rubenstein, town meeting member from precinct 10. And during the spring, I was able to come to a few of the meetings discussing Article 24. And in April, at one of the April meetings, I picked up some materials that you had out, and this is a comment on the fee in lieu section. So I noticed that on 2 different occasions, Jane Armington, who was hired to be the consultant to the planning board as they developed the inclusionary zoning, had made some comments on the fee in lieu section. So I just thought I would share that tonight because that concerned me, what she said. At first, the fee in lieu that you had proposed was 3 times the market, what was it, the median income, there was some formula.
3 times the 80% median household income for a 4-person household for Amherst is calculated by the U.S. Department of Housing.
Thank you. Okay, and I think there was some thought that that was too much and that should be dropped to 1 time. And she commented on that. There were a couple of decisions to drop the affordability threshold from 10% of the project to 7.5. And she didn't have a problem with that. But she did caution that fee in lieu based on a multiplier of 1 for these particular areas is more than generous, I'm quoting her here, and will result in no units actually getting constructed. If anything, I would recommend keeping the multiplier at 3. That's something that I really took to heart because I'm thinking a developer would see that choice and probably take that choice if it was only 1 time, the formula that you announced. And my concern is, okay, that money goes into some kind of fund, maybe the municipal housing trust that just been created, and is held until there's an accumulation. But how long will it take for that affordable unit to really become a unit someone can live in? If a developer needs to build one as part of their project, we're going to see that unit much sooner. So I understand the fee in lieu, but I also understand the need for affordable housing. So one thing I would like to see you balance in the future is not to bow to the pressure of lowering that fee in lieu, because I think having a substantial enough number will actually result in some units that can be inhabited in the here and now and not 10 years down the road. I know Olympia Oaks took, how many, 10 years to build? More, much more. So are we looking at a pile of money that's going to accumulate, and 20 years down the road we're going to have another 15 units or 20 units or 30 units? I'm worried that, I hope that you will really consider keeping at least 3 times and some more realistic fee in lieu. Thank you.
So, thank you. I was going to speak to that real quick. What I didn't read the second part of this was, this is from Article 24 that we proposed to the town meeting in the spring. Was that it goes on to say that in the BG zoning district only, that it would be 1 time the 80% threshold. Now, I mean, you've really gotten to the core of the issue, which is, you know, if the fee in lieu is too high, say that we made the fee in lieu 10 times, right? It's going to suppress all housing development. If we make it too low, like you said, we don't generate enough funds to create units. If we allow a fee in lieu, it's really tricky to set it to the right level. And it becomes particularly tricky in the downtown, which is fully built out almost to every single lot line. There's virtually no available space. So anything that happens there is going to be redevelopment. Given that we do want to encourage redevelopment in our village centers, including downtown general business zoning district, you know, trying to strike that balance is really difficult, and that's actually one of the real issues that we're trying to get at the heart of tonight and try and find out what that number is. Mr. Crowner?
So you said most of what I was going to say. The other item that that is relevant to this part of the discussion is that the alternate means of fulfillment of the mandate, the way we've written it now is at the discretion of the permitting body. If you don't provide the actual unit, the alternate options are at the discretion of the permitting body. So it wouldn't necessarily be a slam dunk that we get to pay the lower fee. Now that might not be the right approach. That's what we, at least the first draft that we have.
In the back.
So Vince O'Connor, Precinct 1 town meeting member, and so you have the proposal that I made jointly with about 10 or 15 other people, and who all of us gathered signatures for. And I think that the thing to focus on is that the existing bylaw essentially does not allow payment of fees in lieu of or donations of land and so forth. And I think that's a proper approach because that results in the production of housing units. I think the interesting contrast between the existing bylaw and what the planning board has been doing is to look at the proposed units at presidential apartments, which resulted, where the permit resulted in a requirement that was agreed to for 6 additional housing units. My understanding is that project is now on hold for a year. And why is that? In part because the planning board is accepting an interpretation of Article 15 that I don't agree with, essentially allowed Kendrick Place to be built with no affordable housing, and essentially Kendrick Place drove the presidential apartments addition out of the market, and in addition to other factors, but that was one of the factors. So I would say that the planning board approach has resulted in the exact opposite of what the board is articulating is its concern. And what the board needs to do is to not focus on projects that are by right, which the Supreme Court, however much we may disagree with who they are and what they say at the present moment, they are there and are likely to be there for a while, and conducting a frontal assault on their rulings, I think, is a direction that I would urge the planning board not to go in. I would say stay away from at-right projects. Don't get us involved in that type of thing. Focus on projects that require a special permit, where the project itself, and focus on, make a list for yourself of all of the housing activities that have been transformed from special permit to either site plan review or by right in the last 15 or 20 years, and say, gosh, maybe we made a mistake in allowing some of these projects to be by right or by site plan review, and move some of those back into the special permit category under the purview of Article 15, because, quite frankly, that's where I think they believe. The idea that Kendrick Place or Carriage Place should be constructed by right, given the enormity of its impact and the complexity of its impact, I think is absurd. I think any objective, outside organizations not being paid by town of Amherst money looks at this and said, this has an enormous impact. This project should not be allowed except by special permit. And if you focus on what you can legitimately impose requirements on, look at some of those activities that have in the past been by special permit and through the board's own activities of the last 20 some odd years been exempted from special permit and moved down essentially the permitting chain. I think you will find there the ability to develop out of the permitting process that you control more affordable housing. I would finally say that the final thing in terms of affordable housing is, as we've seen at Rolling Green, is that requires substantial financial contributions from the town. I don't believe the planning board can actively use any town resources to advocate for the CPA increase. But I think the board can take a position on the CPA increase that will be on the ballot this November, saying that in order to accomplish the town's affordable housing goals, citing Rolling Green and other projects, we must have additional funds. And I hope the board will do that, because that is one of the key ingredients, in addition to the things that I mentioned previously, is having more financial resources available to the town so that when situations like Rolling Green come up, we have the financial resources to do what we all say we believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connor, and you make a good point. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about with finding, and that's why we're having this forum, because, you know, clearly the zoning bylaw itself is inadequate to address the issue of affordable housing in this town. It's simply not something that the planning board can do and inclusionary zoning can do. We're trying to take up one piece of this, and also to facilitate a dialogue about what other pieces we can do. And Rolling Green has been a piece of this. Presidential apartments, I haven't heard any rumors about why or why not that is or isn't happening. And I certainly haven't received anything directly from the property owner saying they are or aren't going forward. You know, the fact is that Amherst needs more housing. That's been detailed over and over and over. In our draft housing market study that came out last November, in our housing production plan that came out last March, in our master plan, and in, you know, I mean, take Rolling Green itself. I mean, the fact that there was such an uproar about losing these units of affordable housing that are so critical to Amherst. I mean, all these pieces fit together, and inclusionary zoning, like we don't want to suppress the production of new housing in Amherst, and we don't, especially where it's going to include affordable housing. That's why we're here. Mr. Tucker.
I would just note on the notion of CPA funds, regardless of what the board might want to do or not do with regard to the ballot issue in the fall, CPA funds, the use of CPA funds or the regular request for the use of CPA funds or funds from a housing trust once it's up and rolling, and that's something that the fees in lieu could help to build, is one of the possible non-zoning tools to provide financial cost offsets for affordable units in those mixed-use centers where it's much more expensive to build anything, much less projects that include affordable units as well.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker.
Offset costs, is that what?
If you could raise your...
Offset costs, and what?
So one of the things that's proposed is that instead of, so the current bylaw, section, Article 15, provides that all residential development requiring a special permit and resulting in additional new dwelling units provide affordable housing units at the following minimum rates. 1 through 9 units, none. 10 through 14 units, 1 affordable unit. 15 to 20 units, 2 dwelling units. 21 units, minimum 12% of the units. So everything over that requires 12%. It does not provide for paying any amount of dollars instead of building those units. The only option is to build units. What we were proposing in Article 24 was to allow developers to pay into a trust fund an amount equal to, so for each unit that they don't want to actually build, they can instead pay the town some money that could then later be used exclusively for the production of affordable housing. All right, and so the amount that you got, if you take that, say that 80% of the minimum income level is $40,000. If the developer has to pay 3 times that, they would have to pay $120,000 per unit that they don't build into the housing trust fund. So if they were required to build 3 units, they would have to pay $360,000 into the housing trust fund. These are numbers I'm pulling out of my head as an example to give you some idea of what we're talking about and how that system would work, which is different from what we have now. Mr. Conner?
That's an alternate way of meeting the mandate. The notion of cost offsets comes into play when units are actually provided. Providing units actually costs a developer money. It has to be subsidized by the market rate units. And so what has been used in many places with inclusionary zoning and what we have proposed is some way of increasing the amount that the developer can recoup through market rate units by allowing more market rate units or by some other method. So the cost offset is a way of making up the difference between the cost of providing an affordable unit and what would the cost be if there weren't any affordable units provided. So it's a way of encouraging or allowing affordable units to be built and not hurting the and we're struggling to find an adequate level of cost offsets to provide, particularly in the downtown. It's the hardest place to balance those matters.
Could you give us an example of these cost offsets?
So if you have to build if by right you're allowed to build 10 units, and again I'm just making these numbers up. By right you're allowed to build 10 units, but our inclusionary zoning requires you to build an affordable unit, 10%, one affordable unit. One of those has to be affordable. So now you have one affordable, 9 market rate. You're not going to get the same return, and your risk is going to be higher in that formulation, as opposed to 0 affordable and 10 market rate. So one of the ways of providing a cost offset is allowing more market rate units. Instead of 1 and 9, you do 1 and 11 is what we're proposing, for instance. And in order to accommodate those extra units, we have to be able to change the dimensions, either add another floor or increase the lot area or something. So that's.
Mr. Tucker.
If I may, it's I think Mr. Crown said this, but I'll just restate it. It's a practical question. If you impose a requirement on developers that costs them more than it's worth for them to do the project, then you don't get the affordable units. That's the balance we're trying to strike. So not to benefit developers, but just to sort of hold them harmless, so that if they are required to build affordable units, whether it's by special permit or site plan review or whatever, that financially they can go ahead and with their project, and the town will in fact get the affordable units. Because if the requirements are too onerous, it won't happen. And in fact, that's why we've been talking about this at all. We've had inclusionary zoning on the books since May of 2005. And we've gotten 6 units out of it, theoretical units, as Mr. O'Connor described, approved in the presidential apartments. That's way less than 1 unit a year. That's not performing well. So the whole question needs to be addressed, but it has a great deal of complexity. One of the handouts is an article on a recent conference on inclusionary zoning, and it cites a consultant saying basically part of the challenge of this is that it's so complicated. It's not simple.
So, I mean, and that kind of cuts the core of it. I mean, is our current bylaw somehow, even as it stands, suppressing the production of housing and affordable units, right? If it's not producing affordable units, I mean, so one of the questions that people ask is inclusionary zoning really necessary? Does it work? If so, how do you implement it? And there are other towns in Massachusetts that are using it, and it has produced affordable units in other towns. So we think that overall that it is worth doing, and we would like to pursue it, and that's been the goal of the board throughout. But we really need help in crafting it so that it works. Yes, in the back.
Jerry Guidera from Gray Street,
Could you
resident.
repeat your last name?
Jerry Guidera, G-U-I-D-E-R.
Thank you.
So, my question is then, what is our measure for success? I mean, if 10 years and it hasn't worked, what would be a measure of success? Where has it worked successfully before? And if it's not working at all, then why do we even have it? I mean, you got at the question that I had in mind, is what's the point? And how are we going to measure that? And are we going to be able to come back in 10 years and, because let's say this passes in 2015, are we going to be able to come back in 2025 and measure it and see if it actually succeeds? What would be that gauge?
Well, that's a good question.
So,
You got your crystal ball again?
well, it would be successful if the town housing inventory is adequate to meet the needs of a wide range of income levels. Right now, we're getting to a point where you either have groups of students renting houses or speculators buying houses to rent to students, or you have very high-end houses. There's become a lack of smaller units, a lack of 1 or 2 bedroom units, a lack of condo units. That is the supply is not keeping up with the demand. So if in 10 years we are not having this discussion, that will be an indicator of success.
But so,
You want to follow up, Mr. Guidera?
yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm looking for is more of a concrete answer. I mean, you said that there's some communities in Massachusetts, I mean, there's inclusionary zoning all over the country. Where has it succeeded, and what have they used as benchmarks for success? Because it seems to me that if we don't really have a set goal, then we probably shouldn't even be having the conversation. And then the other point is, this is just focusing on low-income housing. Really, the problem, as we said at the beginning, as you said at the beginning, was we have a broader crisis. We have a broader deficit of housing at all income levels, but especially at the middle income level.
Yeah, and that, yeah.
Let me just say, this is, the purpose of inclusionary zoning is to address that part of the community's housing issue, which has to do with maintaining and keeping up with our need for affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
This one set of regulations is not designed to solve all of the other problems. The community itself will continue to both seek state and federal funds and raise its own funds through CPA and otherwise to try and create affordable housing projects. We just broke, I think we'll have people living in the units at Olympia Oaks by the end of the summer or the early fall. And likewise, the board has been and will continue to be working on zoning that encourages market rate housing to fill the gap that you just described. And I think one of the things that has happened, and there's sort of an interesting confluence here, we just spent a couple of years, several years, studying this question and gotten the answers back from the studies, the Housing Production Forum, the Amherst Housing Market Study, and at the same time the market is recovering. And we have 20 years at least of pent-up housing need for other than students. So the market itself is responding. The project down at in Pomeroy Village, all of those units are 1- and 2-bedroom units. They're not 2,000 square foot 4-bedroom units for a gaggle of students. Those are aimed specifically at a market that is there, and people are realizing that and trying to build to meet it. So there are several things moving at once here. The market itself will do some of the work. The town will do some of the work with various kinds of zoning. And this piece is how do we maintain, how do we keep up with our affordable housing needs? That's really what this is about.
Yes, how about in the back by the Falcon?
Okay, I'm Nancy Dubin, I'm from Precinct 6 and also a part of Amherst Fair Housing now. And I haven't really kept up to date on this topic, so forgive me if these questions have been answered. But the first thing, I think of two things when David, if you don't mind, was talking about buying out, basically, of the requirement of a certain amount of affordable units. I'm concerned that that kind of thing would continue to encourage a sort of segregation of people in low-cost housing, and we already have that to some extent now in the various places where there is low-cost housing. And I think there is a great value in having more integration of different incomes in housing. So that's one thing I was going to say. And the other thing is, if that money is put aside, I think it would be important to know how it would be used. So for instance, Olympia Oaks, as I understand it, took years and years and years to come to fruition. So what are we going to do with that money? Are we going to just use it for something 5-10 years down the road? That's going to be another project or whatever. So I'm just wondering if those things have been taken under consideration.
Well, first of all, I think we are talking long-term here, so anything that, we're not talking about being able to enact this in the fall and suddenly have dozens of new affordable units popping up in the spring like mushrooms. But we're trying to craft something into the bylaw that's going to work over time to have to nudge things in the direction that we want them to go, and to hopefully create incentives for affordable housing over time. The fee in lieu question is something that we're really trying to get at, and it's accompanying issue of allowing developers to, and this touches on what you were talking about between separations, right? Allowing developers, instead of a fee in lieu or instead of building the units in their development, to build those units somewhere else within a given distance of their own building, right? So all of these things are designed to create that incentive to produce the housing. In other words, you can build your development and you can build your affordable housing and still make your profits. Because the town can't afford, like you said, the town can't currently afford to build all the affordable housing units that it needs. We need to rely, to some extent, on the private sector to do that. And so what incentives do we give them in exchange for, and this comes to, someone mentioned the Constitution, I can't remember who it was, but Mr. O'Connor. The real issue here is if we make our restrictions too strict, then it becomes what's called a taking under the Constitution. And that bylaw that is too strict and extracts too many concessions without giving back something in exchange runs the risk of simply a lawsuit striking it down, rightfully so. Yes, in the front.
John, for Precinct 2. Along those very same lines, I think it's worthwhile to remember that while we're here to talk about affordable housing, that anything that encourages affordable housing is good, and anything that encourages further housing units actually, in the long term, contributes potentially to affordability.
Could we have quiet in the back, please? Ms. Berg, excuse me. Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Cole, I didn't hear the end of what you said.
Simply remaining flexible enough to ensure that more units get built, not just affordable units, has a market effect typically of making all units more affordable, or making the general idea of living in Amherst more affordable.
So generally speaking, increasing the supply reduces the cost. Agreed. Someone over here have a... This in the front.
Heinz Berger, Select Board. I just wanted to maybe contribute a little history about Olympia Oaks, because I've heard it referred to a number of times, because it did take 25 years from when the town took that land for conservation and housing to realize the 42 units that are there now. But it wasn't because we were waiting to slowly accrue funding. There is town funding as part of the contribution. I think there's CDBG and CPA money, but the 25 years is a much longer saga, and it had to do with planning issues and trying to work cooperatively with the university and fraternity park happening, not happening. So that project's heavily subsidized, and I just want to be clear, when we talk about affordable housing, it's a pretty broad category. I think in the drafts that the planning board's been working on, we're talking about defining it as 80% of area median income or less. Projects like Olympia Oaks that bring in a lot of federal and state resources are subsidized at a much deeper level than I think what you're looking at for inclusionary zoning. And, it's just one contributor, so most likely will be much more of a workforce middle income band, and we talk about the extremely low income or low income populations that we do house in public housing, some Ann Whalen and other Amherst Housing Authority projects and other deeply subsidized projects, like even Rolling Green, when it was first constructed. I think that's a little bit of a different category of affordable than what trying to get capturing non-subsidized, which as Mr. Crowner explained, you're capturing, you're having the market rate units allow for the production of the affordable units, and that's why inclusionary zoning only really works in a strong market community. It's not going to work in a weak market community because there isn't enough profit in a deal to be able to do that. And Amherst sits not where Newton or Cambridge sits, which are some of the more successful inclusionary zoning communities, but we have enough that we think it can work if we get the right balance.
Thank you, Ms. Kruger. Mr. Oldham.
Jim Oldham. So I'm hearing a lot about getting the balance right and the need to make sure that there's developers get something back for the cost that you're imposing on them. So I'm looking at the paper that you've put out, one of them about development costs in mixed-use centers, and I think there's nothing here. How are you, I mean, you have no facts. It's all assertions, no numbers, no nothing.
What paper are you referring to, sir?
Development costs in mixed-use centers. So there's a lot of assertions, qualitative comments without any precise quantitative comparisons between downtown and elsewhere, and it only argues one side of the equation. So you have, for example, higher construction costs, and under higher construction costs it points out that there's higher material costs because the developers prefer to build higher quality downtown. And why do they do that? Because they know that they're going to charge rent to a high-end clientele. And I would be very interested to see, for example, what's the cost of a unit at Boltwood Place as compared to a cost of a unit up in North Amherst. So I'm really disturbed to see the planning department putting out literature like this that is making a substantial argument with no numbers, absolutely no numbers, and a series of assertions. Elsewhere it talks about one of the reasons we should give more or ask less of property owners doing development downtown is because those very property owners are milking the current system, are maximizing the profits. It says it right here. They have profitable family properties with no mortgages, and so they see have no interest in developing it further or selling it to someone else to develop. I'm troubled by the process in which that something like this would be put out, again, with absolutely no data, no quantitative data that tells us what the real costs are, and this is supposed to be a document that is guiding thinking about how are you going to strike a balance and decide payment in lieu should be 2 years of annual income versus 3 years based on a document and research like this. There's no numbers. And yet you're going to be making decisions about cost offsets that's quantitative. You're going to be making decisions about payments in lieu that's quantitative. So I'm troubled with that there's a lot of, I've heard it up here 4 or 5 times already, we don't want to discourage development by asking too much of developers, but I have yet to see numbers from anyone in the planning department or the planning board that helps us understand how far is too far. That's one point.
So before you go on, I'd just like to point out that and I mentioned this at the beginning of the meeting, which is that in part, this is the first time I've seen this document in particular, but we're not flying in the dark here. In fact, as Mr. Tucker made really clear, one of the impetus for this change is that we finally received hard data in the form of the housing market study and the housing production plan that came out last year that actually have hard facts about what the housing is in Amherst, what it costs, what our demographics are. And that data has all been reviewed by us. I mean, we've had these delivered, and we have presentations made to the planning board about these 2 documents which had extensive study by vetting and public process. So
but I don't believe they addressed the point that I'm making.
May I finish my sentence, please?
Well, I hadn't finished my presentation. I thought this was a public hearing.
It's a dialogue.
Hearing.
But if you're going to go on for 10 minutes, I'm going to stop you in the middle because you can have multiple issues, and I don't want to lose them. All right. So, regardless of what you think, and if you're going to take issue with one particular document that was on the table, I understand that. But we're here to gather facts. That's why we're here.
Okay.
So
my point about the facts is before you make choices, as you began to do last spring and winter with your previous proposed article, before you take at face value claims of developers and property owners downtown that is, too costly for us to do what you're asking of people in other neighborhoods, let's see some numbers. And I don't believe either of the documents that you made reference to highlighted the difference in costs of doing development downtown from doing development elsewhere. So I don't think either of those documents that you made reference to justify the type of differential treatment of downtown that was being presented to town meeting last spring. That was the point I was trying to make. I hope that's clear.
yes, thank you.
There's been reference to the need to keep this simple and how complex this type of work is. I would argue that one way to keep it simple is to stay away from alternatives of fulfillment. I believe Cambridge doesn't allow alternative ways of fulfillment, but I'd have to double check that, but I'm sure you folks know that. You introduce fee in lieu, and suddenly you have to debate how big is that fee in lieu, and whether it should be the same across town or whether it's different in different places. You omit fee in lieu, and that's a whole set of calculations that you can omit. You omit donations of property, you omit building elsewhere, you simplify the problem, and then you just say, you're building units, some of them have to be affordable. And it addresses the point that someone made earlier, so I won't belabor it, but I think it's an important point, that we should all live together. We don't want segregated housing. So keep it simple and make it easier to come to a solution. Going back to the balance question, the third point, and I'll stop, is yes, if we ask something of someone who has a right to develop otherwise, and we say, we are going to require you to do something, then maybe it's appropriate to include a cost offset. But why is it appropriate when we're granting a special permit, when we're giving someone a privilege that isn't a right privilege, to give them a cost offset? You've taken an existing, you've done two things. One is you've chosen to interpret the special permit, the existing bylaw, in a very narrow way, so as not to apply it to special permits that aren't related to use, but are related to secondary issues about development. And making that, so one reason we've only achieved 6 theoretical units in whatever period Mr. Tucker was saying, was because of that choice of interpretation. A different interpretation, which my reading of the legal letter that you received, was that interpretation could have also been upheld. The law certainly seems to suggest that an interpretation would be allowed, would have generated some more theoretical units as yet to be built Kendrick Place. So the question again is, here we are allowing developers to do something by stretching our rules, by going outside, by giving them something that's not theirs by right. And yet we're not asking anything of them in terms of affordable housing. And further, the way that you've been writing your law is we're going to erase the possibility, instead of special permit developments of any kind being only allowed if they provide units, they're going to get the cost offsets with the affordable units. So it feels like we're getting, on one hand, we're expanding, we're asking more of the by right developers, but we're giving more back to the special permit developers. So I think that also needs to be looked at. Balance is good, but the balance needs to be really balanced. It can't be giveaways to developers or property owners.
Thank you. Mr. Schreiber.
So actually I have a couple of questions and a comment. So because we have so little experience, basically no experience with inclusionary zoning, because the presidential apartments was a zoning board of appeals project, but they were required to provide 6 units, but there was no bonus for that, right? In other words, that was just written so the kinds of things we're talking about, there was no kind of an offset, which is one of the, basically the flaws of that particular, you might argue that's one of the flaws of that. I think that the point that you're making that I agree with is the simplicity. So there's something simple about this idea that for every affordable unit you build, you get 2 bonus units, or whatever the right number is. So that kind of takes care of all the questions that you're bringing up about this document, a lot of the questions about this, because if it's if you're getting building an affordable unit that's out in the woods and made out of cheap construction, then you're basically talking about the same building blocks. It really kind of evens the field if you're really just talking about additional units for every affordable unit. So, I think there's something to that particular argument. The problem, of course, that we've gotten into is basically the downtown area, where we basically hit the impossibility of actually having these, these bonus units being built. But I do think there's something to that, the simplicity. It takes away kind of the smoke and mirrors part of it.
Let's have Mr. Rosenthal back there, please.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. I just want to agree with some of the comments that have been made. Try not to restate them. I'd like to add some additional arguments to the point that Mr. Oldham and Mr. Schreiber were just discussing. Another reason for not having in lieu in the law is that it's not likely to achieve its objective because the money that will be set aside will be residing someplace and earning a modest amount of interest and income before it gets spent, while the cost for construction and land will be accelerating at a far greater rate. So by permitting any amount of money to be set aside in lieu, while it may seem fair at the time, it will not achieve the objective of getting the number of units that it's intended to represent. Another point I'd like to make is the one having to do with the special permit and which buildings or which developments are required to have inclusionary zoning. And I want to thank you and Mr. Tucker again for a dialogue that we had a couple of months ago in which he provided me with a letter from a lawyer in Boston named Joel Barr, and I think that's the letter you were referring to. And I'd just like to read a sentence from it. It says, my initial reading of it, that's section 1510, is the same as yours, namely that the section seems to be intended to apply to residential projects which require a special permit for the project itself, rather than a situation in which an ancillary SP, that special permit, is needed for building coverage or parking or whatever. And he goes on to say that bylaws are subject, and that is one, to several interpretations. Well, I happen to be a lawyer by training, and I happen to have a little bit of experience in zoning since I was at one time the chairman of the Zoning Board of Appeals in Amherst. And I do not read that bylaw as having any kind of limitation such as that. It simply says special permit. And it should be interpreted broadly because we should be applying the same kinds of burdens, if you will, on developers equitably. And that means that every developer of projects that come before you should have the same kind of requirements. And that means that the inclusionary zoning obligation should be spread fairly among all of them. And I think that's if the town decides that it needs affordable housing, and if the town decides that it needs to ask developers to do it, then I think all of them should be required to do this. Now, we've been talking about the difficult burden that having a below market rate dwelling in a project of many other dwellings will impose on a developer. That would be an imposition by law. But developers, and I have been one developing lots of projects, some in this town and some elsewhere, I know that building codes and zoning requirements always impose additional costs beyond what I would have liked to spend. And to isolate one of them and say it's the cost of an affordable housing unit within many other units that is something that the town wants, that cost is a burdensome cost, is putting a burden on the affordable housing. It's not fair to impose that burden on affordable housing. So my points are, spread the burden, if such a burden it is, and recognize that there are many, many costs that developers have to encounter, and this is just one of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tucker?
I wanted to agree with some of what Mr. Oldham said earlier, particularly about the real numbers. Part of the reason that the board decided to ask that Article 24 be referred back was because it was struggling with the different financial number setting for development in mixed-use centers as opposed to development in residential areas where multi-unit development has already occurred or might occur in the future. It's also the reason why the planning department has recommended to the board, since we have lost the services of PDPC housing consultant for excellent reasons, she's on maternity leave, that we consider using some of the board's funds to hire a consultant to deal with this specific question and to generate specific numerical framework within which this can be examined. This is as you say, a set of assertions is a set of assertions based on experience. It's based on some numbers, but those numbers are incomplete. And rather than present an incomplete set of numbers, then argue about how incomplete they are, we decided to just provide the perspective on this. There is not, I believe, anyone in the housing community who would argue with this, with these numbers. They're welcome to do so if they want. But the point is that we agree about the need, absolutely the need for a framework of real numbers, and we are promoting the notion that we need to go and get assistance to obtain that.
So I just wanted to point out to, you know, with respect to reading this and the point that Mr. Rosenthal brought up, you know, the language it says, all residential development requiring a special permit and resulting in additional new dwelling units shall provide affordable housing units at the following minimum rate. And also speaking to what Mr. Oldham said about treating things differently. I mean, a really simple fix without trying to get complex and without trying to tease out some of the more difficult issues around this would be simply to strike the words requiring a special permit from this bylaw. It would simply apply it across the board to all housing projects. That's like a really simple fix that you could do with this. However, you know, would that have the effect of, you know, squashing currently by right housing projects that might, how do we say it? You know, if any housing unit that's built relieves somewhat our pent-up demand for housing in this town, which is well detailed, regardless of whether it distinguishes between downtown and outlying areas. There's clearly a need for more housing in town, especially in the middle and low income levels. So, you know, doing that, simply striking the words requiring a special permit, we didn't think that's a good idea. I mean, it's not, there's just so much more there. For instance, and this came up too with respect to downtown, one of the things that we were struggling with, one of the particular issues, was how do we allow those cost offsets in terms of extra units downtown when a lot is fully built out, all right? Say that we've got a 5-story building downtown that's going to be redeveloped, and it has 20 units, and they're going to be required to put 2 units in. So they say, okay, we'll put the 2 units in. Where are we going to put our extra 4 units that we get in exchange? We'd really like to have a 6th floor, right? We already have 6-story buildings downtown. They're owned by the town, in fact. So is a 6th floor option a good idea downtown or elsewhere? Is a particular issue, and it was one of the particular issues that we specifically wanted to ask you all about. Do you want to see 6-story buildings downtown? In the 3rd row there? Yes.
Well, the answer to that brief question is yes. And the answer is yes, because I think we're looking at some very, Morianne Avenue, sorry, precinct there. I think we're looking at difficult trade-offs. And from my perspective, it's not just the issue of affordable housing, but it's the siting, the location, the convenience of affordable housing. I'm not an economist or a business person, I'm an academic, and so I don't understand the difficulties about the downtown. I mean, I understand this business of offsets. It seems to me that having affordable housing downtown is a primary value. It's better than sprawling affordable housing where there aren't buses, where it's not convenient, where there aren't places to shop. It's also better than building affordable housing or any other kind of housing on wetlands, of which we have more than enough of throughout the town of Amherst. It's, to me, preferable to seeing the village centers as an option, because I see the village centers deflecting from the downtown. I live very close to the downtown, and it's not, to me, a tremendously vibrant, interesting adult space. So I would really like to see much more done with the downtown. And if it involves 6 stories, from my point of view, so be it, even though I'm not a big building kind of person. Now, there's another point I'd like to make. We keep raising the issue about if we build it, the students will come. You know, we've seen this with some of the difficulties of by right and duplexes, etc. I would like to press very hard, particularly in the context of our close conversations with the university, that this is the moment to make public-private partnerships a priority and a test case, a pilot in Amherst. We know that our legislature supports that. We know that we have representatives from Amherst who support that. We know that the university has been talking about it, although I'm afraid they're talking about it in Boston and not here in Amherst. And even though it may not be a town it may not be the town prerogative to make this kind of claim for the university. I think we really have to face the student issue and encourage the building of public-private partnerships on public land, University Drive, Mass Ave, Eastman Lane, some place where they are distinct from the kind of economic development that we're hoping for in the downtown that will also then allow for affordable housing. We know that the university, for example, has gotten significant money for medical, technical, neuroscience, other kinds of possibilities. That's another place where we can be doing coalitions. It may involve more staff, more faculty with their families. So we really have to make the downtown and the adjacent to town areas, I think, really attractive for, by which I mean, I've made this statement time and again. My whole career has been working with students. I'm not speaking about students, but I'm speaking about congregations, in the intensity of student moving into an area because we really haven't planned areas where students might really belong. So it seems to me that we're having to talk about the big picture. We're having to talk about where we want the students to move. We have to be talking about the economic development in downtown. And as we talk about affordable housing, I think we really need to talk about where it should go. And in my view, we really need to start with whatever economic problems are facing the business downtown that prevents the kind of development that we've been wanting for the 30 years, 40 years I've been living here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Yes, in the back corner. I'm going to call on people I haven't heard from yet until we get to everybody.
Thank you. Janet Keller, Precinct 1. I agree with a lot of the preceding comments, and I'm not going to be immediately preceding comments, and I'm not going to repeat them. Instead, I'm going to go to, I made the very strange choice of getting to a little deep into this inclusionary zoning thing. And so I've been watching this with quite a bit of interest, and I would like to talk for a couple of minutes about presidential apartments and get us thinking about what lessons we can and can't draw from that example, okay? And I would like us then to extrapolate from that about how careful we need to be in our analyses, and Maureen's tired of hearing me say that in some other
Never
venues. But anyway, Presidential Apartments developer was going to build 54 units. And out of those, 6 were going to be affordable, and out of those, 3 were going to be handicapped accessible. And I don't know whether, I don't know why it stalled, if it stalled. I personally saw the earth-moving equipment out there and said, yay team, but I'll have to go, I don't know whether it stalled. But in any case, the developer was going to provide those units. Why would that be? Why would that be? Well, first of all, it was required to under Article 15 of the present zoning law. That's the inclusionary zoning piece that people have been talking about. And it happened to be the case that in that particular instance, those apartments were on RN, residential neighborhood zone land. So he fell into that very narrow niche. He also got some considerable other privileges, changes, if you will, in that zoning. He needed some things moved around a little bit on the site to get those 54 apartments in on a very wet site. So why was he going forward with that, and perhaps still going forward with that? And all I can think is that it made sense that this is a developer who ran the numbers and said, I can do this for that price, and it's worth doing. So I think we need to ponder that and think, as we think about all these options that people have been put forth. He was going to build the units. on the same site as the market units, at the same time as the market units. He was going to throw in 3 fully accessible apartments to go in there. I don't think that this was a person who didn't know what they were doing. I think it was a very competent developer, and I ask us to think about that. And while we're at it, I think I will ask us to think about people who don't have a decent roof over their heads, and let's not forget about them things.
Yes, in the back.
Yes, Helen Berg. I'd like to follow up on the last few people who commented. Mr. Rosenthal talking about having all developers adhere to this. I find it reprehensible that somebody that's building 1 to 9 units, such as St. John's at the Trolley Barn, 4 units that can be subdivided in a multi-use building, is not included in this inclusionary housing. Secondly, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to this map I found that's based on the 2010 census. And take a look at the hot areas, the orange, the red, the yellow. These are all not university properties, but these are all student sprawl from UMass. And I would suggest that the market rate is not a real market rate, but an inflated rate, because we are at the mercy of UMass. I'm an alumna. Nonetheless, this sprawl should not be allowed to continue. If you look at the university itself, it has less density than many of the neighborhoods outlying, especially North Amherst. We want to take the Cushman out. Take a look at it. It's called Housing Market Study, Town of Amherst, based on the 2010 census.
Thank you, Fred. And I think we're all in agreement that, we have issues with student housing in this town.
I just wanted to note, I guess this is in response to Ms. Keller's comments, and it's just a fact, and not arguing one thing or another, but I just wanted to note that residential apartments didn't have any land costs. That land was owned by the developer and had been owned by him for, probably 30 or more years. So there were no land costs involved in that. So, whatever his pro forma was, I think he had a little bit easier situation financially than someone who's coming in and buying a piece of land and intending it to develop it now, because the land costs have really skyrocketed in the last 30 or whatever years. Just a fact.
Thank you for sharing the fact with us. That is true. So let's take another specific that we were looking for tips on. And I think we've gotten some good input so far on some issues about whether to allow fees in lieu, and we haven't actually had any suggestions about what that amounts would be. Rather, I think we've just heard that it should be removed, and also the same with off-site. So I wanted to just take a moment and address off-site location. In other words, if a developer is building 20 units in one place and they're required to put 2 affordable units in, can they put in a duplex down the street 300 yards and have that qualify as their affordable units as long as they qualify? So as I was reading through some of the literature of other towns that have experimented with inclusionary zoning, I was looking at the town of Groton, Massachusetts, which, like Amherst, has about 11,000 year-round residents, but they don't have a university. And so they're really a very small town. And they had a off-site location provision in their inclusionary zoning. And I'll thank Ms. Kruger for providing the links to these presentations. What happened in their case was that they had a developer that elected to build units in an off-site location. And the off-site location required a special permit to do that. And the abutters then successfully challenged and stopped the development of the off-site affordable housing units under a special permit. So there, each of these provisions has potential issues with it and unforeseen consequences. And I wanted to see if anybody in the room has any input on on allowing off-site. We've had a little bit of talk about how it separates the rich and the poor. Does anybody have any specific experience or comments on that issue? Ms. Adams?
Yes, just very briefly, I was interested to read in the New York Times some weeks ago about some of the experiences of affordable houses in deluxe units within the city. The article pointed out how many of them had separate entrances, how many of the members were not able to use the gym or the pool, that sometimes there were really physical divisions between the affordable segment and the upscale segment. I was really quite horrified to read this. I wasn't aware of that kind of what am I trying to say?
Downton Abbey.
Thank you, yes. Exactly, I think that's what I was going for. So that was a very concrete example of the creativity of some builders and developers to try to keep them segregated. And that is why I would oppose a building elsewhere and encourage the integration architecturally.
Can I get one clarification?
Yes,
when you said,
just let us know your name.
Julie Marcus, when you said to build, did you also include to renovate in that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because it wasn't.
I was using shorthand, but yeah, I believe it does include renovation.
Okay, because they're different. I wanted to just be clear on that. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Brester.
I think it only includes renovation if that results in new units. I think there's the word new in there.
Or change of use, maybe, too?
So whatever results in new units
buildings.
is the number that you use, rather than if you're renovating something that already exists and you're not creating any units.
Mr. Tucker?
I believe the intent, and you haven't written the language yet, so you can do what you wish with this, but the intent is the creation of units that are affordable, that are new as affordable. There may be 8 units in an existing building within the downtown or a village center that are in that center and have the same access to all of the services and everything else. But those units are not affordable now. They're not permanently affordable. They don't contribute to the town's subsidized housing inventory. Those units were renovated and made permanently affordable. I believe under the existing language they would be counted. And I think it was the intent that they be counted. But that's a question.
Sure, and we're trying to redraft this, so anything, that's part of what we're trying to get at. Yes, follow-up?
Yeah, the follow-up to that is, so just as an example, if somehow, I don't know, the fire department piece of land became available and you could build a big building downtown, you could presumably then buy up some horrible old student housing buildings, renovate them and turn them into beautiful low-income housing buildings, and that would count, but could that get blocked by neighbors because that would require a special permit?
So that would depend upon the zoning and the particular type of use and the lot coverage and so forth.
So it's just complicated.
Yeah, like anything else, it depends.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a reasonable
and
answer.
And there could be tax consequences too.
Yeah.
Mr. Schreiber.
So the good news is that we got ahead of this a little bit through the affordable duplex that was passed a year or so ago. So at least if it's a duplex in the RG zone, then we're okay. One thing about that New York Times article, and I'm not sure, I might be misremembering this, but I believe that the inclusionary zoning is voluntary. So in New York City. So I think that was mentioned in the article, but we don't have a provision for voluntary inclusionary zoning, do we? So in other words, no one could propose to us, or could they, to voluntarily include affordable units and in return get more units.
Mr. Tucker.
One of the provisions, and it's not really a non-zoning cost offset, it's more of an option for flexibility that other communities have used are what are called affordable housing credits. That if someone builds affordable housing, let's say they're required to under inclusionary zoning, but they build 3 more than they're required to, you get a certificate from the community that says you have a credit for 3 units that you can apply to a future project, you can sell to another developer, you could give to a nonprofit housing corporation, And I think you could structure it so that the same could be true of someone who was providing affordable housing but didn't have to. They weren't captured under the inclusionary zoning. They were building something, less than 10 units, and so they weren't caught, but decided to add a couple of affordable units anyway, and as a consequence could get that benefit from the community.
I like that idea a lot. I mean, in terms of what we're trying to do here and reduce blockages to the production of affordable housing, I mean, if we're gonna say, if you're required to, go before the zoning board of appeals for your project, then you've gotta build the affordable units. Well, if you have a project that you're building by right, you'd like to build it bigger. You may say you've got more room on your lot you want to use, you want to put more units in, then you can do that by adding affordable units in by right, developments too. I kind of like that idea. It's a clever idea, and thank you for that. Mr. Oldham.
I wanted to speak to your earlier question, and also I was thinking about something fairly similar to what Mr. Tucker was just mentioning. So first, to your earlier question, when I had an opportunity a number of months ago to speak to a woman who works in the Cambridge program, in the inclusionary housing program in Cambridge, and she was adamant when I spoke to her about how important they feel it is that the units be in the same place and be identical. She said, if you're doing granite countertops, you're doing granite countertops. I mean, they take it to that level of detail, that it's not two different types of housing, it's affordable housing of whatever quality and whatever location that you're providing. You provide 10% of it is affordable, of the same quality, in the same place. And she said that that's what makes the program work. If you do it in a different place, sure, you can build beautiful duplex, or you can continue the slum duplex that we currently have. And there's no guarantee that you'll deliver the former. So I feel very strongly that it is important that it's in the same place. And I wanted to go, and I was thinking back, so what do we do, the question Mr. Schreiber raised earlier about what happens in downtown where we don't have space to do the cost offsets. And I think Mr. Tucker's concept is exactly right. Don't postpone the affordable housing and set it off-site or set it into the future with payments in lieu or something like that. Say, deliver the affordable housing here and now where you're doing your development. If you don't have room for those extra units, give them the certificate that can be sold to another developer or applied to a different unit so that they get the bonus. It's like transfer of development rights. It's a saleable, valuable transfer of development rights, but the affordable housing comes first. The town gets the affordable housing that we require, and then the developers can take that, transfer it to another future development, sell it to another developer, get the bonus, but don't make it's always, what comes last always? It's the affordable housing. What comes last always? It's the poor members of the community. Don't do it that way. Turn it around.
I think I saw a hand up in the second row.
Naomi Elliott, I just had a question. How many parcels, we're talking about downtown Amherst, inclusionary zoning is 9 units and above. How many identifiable parcels really would hold more than 9 units? And then if they do go up and they afford more units, if they're tight parcels, where does everyone park? So, I just have no idea. So we're talking about a downtown area that's very discreet, and I don't see how this all works, quite honestly. So just my question, I have no idea.
Yeah, so I think, you
Sorry,
bring up a valid point.
I just don't see it.
Understood. I'm really glad that you brought that up because everything ties together. And, if we don't, tonight we're not going to talk about parking.
We'll ask about it.
Right? But it's now, you brought it up as a factor in allowing us downtown. It's certainly something that we got to consider with respect to individual projects as they come up.
And I guess my question is, can we provide a discrete number of parcels that would actually fit within the downtown area? How many would there be that would actually, and the other question I do have is, I'm a little confused when you're talking about affordable units. We're talking about rentals. Is that correct?
No.
No. So, and then the question is, again, the market for whatever units that might be rentals or not, who are we attracting? I mean, will families go into these 10-story buildings if we want more children in our school system? You know, I just, the questions.
No one said 10, but.
Well, I don't know, I
Understood.
have no
Any
idea.
questions? Mr. Tucker?
If, one of the things about downtown property lines is that they're plastic. They can go away. Somebody can assemble more than one property
Yes,
together.
I understand that, yeah.
It's expensive, which is one of the assertions in that
like
document,
monopoly.
but that, in order to do, right now, the way the financial situation is, most commercial banks are not lending for projects, even with interest rates quite low. Instead, people are seeking equity partners, people who are looking to invest, and that changes the dynamic somewhat. Makes it a little less sure, it makes it a little more risky. However, I think we're looking at a situation where, what I wanted to do is I wanted to switch back to a couple of points that had been made by Mr. Oldham, if I may.
Yeah, okay.
And that was that the bylaw already speaks to the question of the quality and the nature of each unit. So that it essentially says, and it could be amended to be strengthened, that individual units that are affordable have to be the same as the market rate units, essentially. It also talks, and we're attempting to introduce criteria that speak to location in terms of having access to the same services as anything else. One of the possible amendments that came in late after Article 24 actually came from the town manager, who said, why does it make any difference in terms of distance from the parcel as long as you're in the same district if you're in a mixed-use center? You want the units in the center, why couldn't they be anywhere in that district? And so they could. And all of this is plastic. However, I am going to stay away from the third rail parking for now. That's a whole other forum. That's a whole other forum.
Yeah, so we don't have I don't think anybody's going to be able to come up with a parcel count for you for downtown right
Well,
off the
I
top of our
just,
head.
I mean,
We can,
excuse me, it just seems like we're talking about a lot of changes for perhaps an impact on a very small amount. And I don't know if that's true for housing. And the other question I have, or one mistake I'll make, is that what drives demand everywhere is demand. So that a developer can command a certain price is not because the developer chooses that. The market, who are the buyers, are going to agree to that price. So, you know, it's kind of like we can say, well, the developer does this, but if he sets a price or does this development and someone buys it on the open market or rents it, that means he's meeting that demand for that buyer, and that's kind of where he's going for. So the developer doesn't always drive everything or set the tone, but the people at the end users are the ones that a lot of times set the tone.
Right, and what we're talking about here is the segment of the population that can't actually drive that because they have no money. And unless the government steps in and provides some guidance and some rules, that low-end housing doesn't get built at all. And I mean, that's the tough part about this, is that, you know, we do want all of that, and how do we do it? So those are really good questions. Yes, in the back.
I know you're trying to quit at 9, and I just don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about non-zoning possibilities.
Sure, go right ahead.
Can we? What's your name? My name is Julie Marcus. So my question, and I don't think the planning board is allowed to do this, but the select board is also here. So, and I'll give this example. I have a solar powered building, and the Commonwealth decided that they wanted more photovoltaics. So they put in a little piece of legislation that said, if you build a solar array, the value of that array and the value of any HVAC system that it powers can be abated on your property taxes for 20 years. So the state made it possible, and the town adopted this little piece of legislation that got a lot more PV on roofs. And it had nothing to do with zoning. You know what I mean? It just had to do with photovoltaics. So can there be some other little piece of legislation, either on the state level, and I think the state might be working on something like this, or the local level that says, if you have an affordable unit, we are gonna give you some kind of incentive, tax-wise, that super simplifies this, because it has nothing to do with zoning. And I don't know how that would work with rental versus ownership. I mean, somebody with a bigger brain would have to think this through, but there are other ways to do this, and I think other towns have incentivized this through property taxes. Am I wrong? Can you just speak to us about what you know about that?
There's a handout that describes this in general terms. I am not an expert. I had conversations with the assessor, I had conversations with some housing consultants and some others, and the summary is the result. Yet this is one more reason why we want to be able to bring someone on board who has experience, broad experience with affordable housing in other communities. However, there are a number of sort of tax-related things that are possible. Right now, for instance, Amherst Housing Authority properties have what's called a pilot payment in lieu of taxes that is enabled through state law, and the developer and the town could negotiate one of those so that they would be providing a regular but lower payment in taxes for either a period of time or in perpetuity. There is a tax increment financing option available for affordable housing. It was just recently created. It's incredibly complicated rather than simple, but it is out there. The community has to create an affordable housing zone associated with an urban center, and not only create a detailed plan about that, but include agreements with property owners and developers in order to get the state to approve it. And then once that happens, the same kind of tax increment financing that Amherst currently makes available to 3 different sets of areas in the community: Bristol Market, Atkins Farm Market, and some of the properties where your business is located, in fact, would enable property owner to pay diminished taxes and then slowly increase their taxes over a period of time, 5 to 10 years, until it came back up to what the normal rate would be. Understanding that assessors value properties that have affordable housing units in them lower than a property that's just market rate, whatever it is, whether it's housing or commercial or whatever, so that the standard point you're coming back up to is lower than other uses. Tax abatements are usually not used by communities in Massachusetts. It gets complicated. It requires that the community agree on a tax levy in advance that includes, for the coming year, and unless it knows what's happening in that coming year, it has to include all of those abatements that are about to happen. And that also has the feature that Amherst might agree to, but other communities in many cases have not, which is that everybody else is subsidizing that abatement.
Which I think is one of the attractive things about this, because I feel like this is that affordable housing is a community value, and that it is also a community responsibility. And one way to approach this is to spread that responsibility across the community and not be dependent on one person who owns a piece of downtown property to shoulder the responsibility for everyone. I feel the same way about farmland preservation. We don't expect the farmer to never retire. The farmer gets to go to Florida, and the rest of us buy up the development rights to the farm, so we all get to drive by and look at it. You know, we have shouldered this responsibility equitably. And I feel the same way about affordable housing. There's got to be a way to do this so that we all hurt a little bit so that we get this thing that we all want. I mean, I think we've demonstrated we want this to happen. So we need to find a way to spread the love and the pain around a little.
If I may, we had mentioned earlier also that both Community Preservation Act funds, regardless of what happens in the fall, and housing trust funds, some of which might be filled through fees in lieu, could also contribute, could be used by the town in negotiations with developers as they come in, doing projects that are caught under inclusionary zoning to help defray the costs. again, this is a context that requires, as Mr. Oldham pointed out, and I strongly agree, within which we need to know what the numbers are. We need to know, there are so many different ways to move the value in this, with either direct cost offsets or elements of flexibility, that we won't know which ones to use unless we have that grounding set of data about what the costs are.
And some of this has nothing to do with the planning board, right?
I'm sorry?
Some of this has nothing to do with the planning board. It's little bits of things that have to be done by other boards.
That's right.
But they impact.
Right.
Right, in the very back in the red.
Hi, my name is Sharon Daltrey. Have handicapped disabled units also been included in this low-income housing? Is it being considered, or is it automatic?
I don't believe it's directly written into our draft. Was there any discussion of that, Mr. Crowder?
We have talked about when we were creating bonuses or increased allowances, we were talking about building in additional bonuses for provision of affordable, accessible units. I think at some point we took them out because it was adding layer of complexity, but it's definitely something that we've considered and you know, could be considered again.
Thank you. Ms. Keller?
Just one other thing that occurred to me was that we were talking about the inclusionary zoning for Amherst and noting that it hadn't produced net units. And then I was thinking about the dates. We talked about Cambridge, and that produced 450 units since 1998. And I think the time periods are really significant. And so, once again, you know, just helps us to have more empirical data and then see what it tells us. So, here in Amherst, we had 9 years of inclusionary zoning, 6 of which it was nearly impossible to get a bank to give you anything unless you were putting 90% down. But Cambridge not only has more people, more money, more everything, but they had 16 years. And so the 3, you know, it had a far smaller impact, that lending problem on them. So it's just something to think about.
Mr. Tucker, I just want to make the cautionary comment that one of the factors that makes inclusionary zoning work is that it is tailored to and responds to those real numbers about the community to which is being applied. Cambridge is a profoundly different community than Amherst, and it has a market that never stops no matter what you do. It doesn't matter. During the Great Depression, there was more growth in Cambridge than anywhere else in the world. No. I invite you to take up, if there are communities that you really think have interesting and useful inclusionary zoning provisions, please let us know about them. But one of the things I would ask you to do is to go on Google Earth and get the satellite photo of that community and then reduce it so that it's smaller, and then go on Google Earth and get the satellite photograph of Amherst, put them at the same scale and set them next to each other. Cambridge is buildings from border to border with a few parks in it. Amherst has little spots of development. It certainly has a fair amount of sprawl, but it does not have a lot of urbanized area, and the market, while we are probably the strongest market in the region, is profoundly different. So whatever we craft for Amherst has to fit Amherst. And Cambridge is an inspiring example, and we hope to get results as good, but we don't have the same kind of market to work with.
Thank you. Yeah, Ms. Berg.
Yes, Helen Berg. I think we may be putting the cart before the horse in some ways, because I know that a lot of people, including Town Manager John Musante, said he wanted to preserve the rural character of Amherst, yet I keep hearing the word urban centers coming up from people that don't even live in Amherst, which is discouraging, because when we have about 9,000 permanent residents of Amherst, it is a rural place. place. So I would like to see the planning board inquire of the people in town whether they would like to see UMass house more students on campus rather than let the sprawl continue.
Thank you. So as long as we're on other non-zoning tax breaks, certainly one of those things that was brought up earlier is the public-private partnerships issue. I believe our state legislatures are working on that, but I don't know of any active bill. If there is one, please let me know. I'd be really interested to hear about it. I know that public-private partnerships do exist in other areas of Massachusetts law. They're doing public-private partnerships for some transportation projects under a pilot project with the Department of Transportation right now. So there is some precedent for that. I also am fortunate enough, I'm serving on the Town Gown Steering Committee, which is in session right, we'll be having another meeting in a few weeks, which has hired a consultant to try and pursue joint planning opportunities for the university and the town in terms of economic development and housing, and there are other members of that committee in this room as well, with the goal of trying to facilitate town-gown relations. The current chancellor of UMass has reached out to the town and actually spoke to town meeting for the first time in anyone's memory. Chancellor Sumaswamy has indicated and has really been reaching out to Amherst to try and find ways to work together and to solve some of the problems that we're having as a community, because some of those problems that we are experiencing are, the university is having the same problems. They want to work with us to fix them. Currently, they're prohibited from doing so in one way, which would be exceptionally helpful. So hopefully we can get to that. I don't think that's within the scope of anybody in this room to take care of. I don't see any legislators here, but certainly we can make our voices heard, right? Or maybe I do.
I'm an aide.
You're an aide?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought I recognized you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Take care of
Yeah, right, sure. Check that off the list.
All right. No, that's great. Thank you for coming in. Please do convey our thanks to Representative Story for sending a representative to tonight's meeting. Anyone? Ms. Adams?
Yes, I just have a question, and that is, much that we've raised bear on the issue of inclusionary zoning, and yet are outside the jurisdiction of the planning board. And so I'm wondering, what would be the mechanism to have the kind of public discussions about tax incentives, other parts of this puzzle that would impact the choices that you make about inclusionary zoning? Would that be a select board responsibility? Would that be a town manager responsibility? I would feel much more confident leaving this meeting knowing that there was some way to have those at least a conversation about that was public.
So some of those things require legislative action. Some of the ones that Mr. Tucker was referring to, pilot payment of taxes and other of the tax incentives, actually, because of the way the law is set up, they're very limited. Towns have very limited taxation powers, which is why we come up with things called payment in lieu of taxes that are actually taxes. And so, or call them fees, or what have you.
Taxes in lieu of taxes.
Right. So the legislature plays a part in it, but I think it would require some very interested and involved citizenry outside of the scope of what any of our normal boards are doing. I think individuals would have to take it upon themselves to work together and try and get the law changed on some of these things, or to get legislative action. Maybe I'm wrong. Any suggestions? Mr. Olden.
I would suggest, and I appreciate that the select board majority is here in official session. I've felt for a long time that the planning board, by virtue of your your frequent meetings and hard work are the people that citizens often come to about these issues, whether or not they fall in the scope of your purview, within your purview. And I think that the select board, as the executive of the town, needs to take it upon themselves to convene a wider dialogue, that because they are in a position then to ask of the various committees in town to work on things, to speak on, to potentially reach out to the legislature when we need to go beyond the town. But we need our executive to take a leadership role in tying together the issues that the planning board can work on and the issues that others can. So again, I'm very pleased that 3 select board members are here and that the select board is in session. I presume then that this, hopefully will go into their minutes.
Thank you. I believe your message has been heard.
If I could just, we're in another meeting, the bubble is, I think that Mr. Hayden spoke to that point in his very opening remarks, so maybe we're circling back and closing that loop where he said the select board was interested in looking at the non-zoning aspects, and so it's, part of this is a listening session. I think some of the things that were sketched out in the memo that we just saw tonight need more research. So it's not an instant thing, but I hear you, and I think we came open to that idea.
Thank you.
Yes, and back.
I'd like to return to something that I brought up at the beginning of the session, and that is that I think while it might be heresy here at a inclusionary zoning meeting to bring this up, I think the bigger crisis is not at the low-income housing, it's at the middle-income housing, and that's what those surveys say. And so what I would urge, whether it's the select board or the planning department, is to remember that we don't just have a deficit of housing at the bottom, we have it at the bottom, at the middle bottom, and at the middle. And so if we're going to end up putting in some restrictions or some incentives or whatever it is that's going to have an impact on the general housing stock, which we know is still too short, then we need to go back and look at it and think about the impacts it would have on those other areas of housing stock, because the demand is broader and the housing stock is such that that's what we need across the board.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gadara. And the thing is that the students by virtue of their spending power, exert pressure on the bottom and the middle of the market, and take up housing that would otherwise be occupied by young families. And so, it's simple math. I mean, 4 students that can pay $500 per room to rent a 4-bedroom house can price out an equivalent family that might want to rent that house, and it raises all rents.
Right, and that's why when we talk about ideas that are outside of just the zoning, we have to think about those real life cases. I remember when Connie brought up the fact that her daughter, who I went to high school with here in Amherst, can't afford to live in Amherst. I don't have a single friend from when I went to high school who can still afford to, unless of course they inherited a house. And so, maybe it's not a zoning issue that the planning board can address. Maybe it is something the select board can address, or maybe whatever it is. But the fact is, what I would say is just let's keep that in mind as we look for ways to help out and figure out this issue, because we need more housing, period.
Thank you. All right, anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak tonight that's maybe been holding back and just want to say something? Mr. Cronin.
So one of the things that I hoped to get out of this meeting was some sense of what other non-zoning issues, non-zoning solutions or pieces of the puzzle are going to be pursued, and what the timeline is for that, because it impacts on whether we're going to be able to bring an inclusionary zoning bylaw to the fall town meeting. If there's something, if the cost offsets that are going to be created, or however it's going to make it possible for housing and affordable housing to be developed, are not in place, or not imminently in place, does it make sense to complete this process? I don't know. I need to know it.
Mr. Tucker?
I'd like to repeat my drumbeat of argument for obtaining consultant assistance. We have gotten, the board at its last meeting looked at a scope of services and reduced it and to 2 items, and then could ask that the others be considered as an add-on. And the cost has basically been cut in half for those 2 items. We're looking at $7,500 now rather than $13,500 is a general estimate. We still have to put it out to others. But people think that work could be done between now and the fall, whatever else happens, and it's that framework of information that will let us know which of these other options we may not need non-zoning options. Maybe we just need to tinker with some of the zoning options. Maybe we will need the non-zoning options. We can't know that until we have that framework of the numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. All right, I don't see any more hands, and it's 9 o'clock almost, so thank you all for coming. I really appreciate all your input, and thanks for coming.